Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. Eliza Marin lived as though she had memorized the rhythm of the earth and walked in harmony with it. There was a quiet, deliberate nature to her being. Every step, every blink, every breath seemed to have been carved from stillness. Her neighbors often remarked, in hushed tones over simmering pots and sweeping brooms, that she carried herself like a woman with secrets too sacred for human ears. She didn't shout across the fences like the other women did when they were calling their children in from the dirt roads. Her voice was never heard bouncing through the market square, haggling over yams or bitter leaf. Yet somehow Eliza was known, revered even, not because she made noise, but because she didn't need to. She had the sort of presence that made people sit straighter and speak softer in her company. Some said she was cold, others said she was holy, but those who looked closely could tell her silence wasn't emptiness, it was full, almost too full, like a dam holding back water that knew the right moment to break would come. Eliza didn't believe in wasting words. She believed some truths, when spoken too quickly, lost their weight. She believed that silence could sometimes speak more loudly than sound. And she had learned, through years of heartbreak stitched into quiet days, that a woman's strength wasn't always shown in how she fought, but in how she stood. She wore her dignity not like armor, but like a second skin, unseen but ever present. Even the birds that landed near her garden seemed to chirp more carefully, as though aware of her aura. There was something about the way she watered her plants, how she sang hymns under her breath as she hung her laundry, that made people wonder if angels paused to listen. Her silence was not submission, it was control, and control was the only thing she had never allowed the world to take from her. Her home stood on the gentle bend of Marigold Road, where the wind turned before it reached the fields and the sky opened wide enough to let prayers through. The house had been built by hands that believed in labor and worship in equal measure, her grandmother's hands, gnarled from work, yet soft from love. That home was more than wood and stone. It was a monument. Each beam held a story, each tile a testimony. The fireplace was more than warmth. It was where the word was read every morning, where tears had been wiped by scripture, and where victories had been whispered into worn walls. There was a worn wooden cross nailed above the front door, slightly tilted, untouched for decades because it had grown into the frame. Visitors always commented on the scent of lavender that lingered in the hallways, not knowing it came not from a bottle, but from decades of dried herbs Eliza hung from her pantry rafters, lavender, thyme, basil, and rosemary, all for different things, cleansing, protection, memory, and healing. Even the air inside the house felt different. It carried a weight, a reverence, as if the house itself had learned how to pray. And Eliza, its keeper, was both priestess and steward. She cleaned not only to keep dirt away, but to keep disorder from seeping in. She swept every corner like she was casting out unrest. She polished furniture like one would polish truth, delicately, but without excuse. Her home was not grand in the worldly sense. There were no chandeliers, no velvet curtains or gold trimmings, but there was peace, palpable peace, the kind that made guests linger at the doorway, unsure if they should remove their shoes or confess something. And for Thomas, her husband, that peace had once been enough. It had held him, anchored him, but over time, even peace began to bore him. He was a man who craved change, even when everything around him was still blooming. And when a man can no longer sit still in a house built on prayer, he starts listening for other voices, voices that don't challenge him, don't know his sins, and don't smell like forgiveness. Eliza knew this. She didn't need to be told. Her house may have been quiet, but its walls spoke to her in dreams. Thomas Marin was not a wicked man, not in the way villagers pointed fingers and muttered curses, but he was a man of shallow waters. What Eliza built with soul, he saw in function. She married him when his eyes still sparkled with dreams too big for Eden, more and too small for commitment. Back then, she believed love could teach him how to stay, how to belong. But loving a man like Thomas was like pouring water into a basket. You try and try again, until one day you realized the basket was never meant to hold anything at all. His business kept him on the road, selling and inspecting land, shaking hands with city men who praised his wit and envied his charm. He came home smelling of aftershave and foreign towns, speaking of buildings she'd never seen and people she'd never meet. At first he brought back trinkets, bracelets, woven shawls, imported teas. But over time, the gifts grew fewer, and the distance between his eyes and hers grew wider. He grew fond of checking his watch while she spoke. He spoke more to his ledger than to her. The little things that once tethered them, shared evening walks, the way he used to bring her the first mango of the season, the way he said, "I missed you," like it was a secret just between them, all of it faded. And what replaced it was absence. Cold, echoing absence. She saw it in the way he touched her out of routine, not passion. In the way he laughed less, smiled rarely, and avoided eye contact when she brought up the garden or the cracked back fence. She never once accused him of infidelity. She didn't need to. Her spirit was too attuned to his. When he sinned, her soul sighed. When he lied, her bones stiffened. She asked God every night, not for revenge, but for revelation. If truth were a flame, she asked to feel its warmth, not to burn anyone, just to know where to place her feet next. It was in the late hush of an ordinary Thursday that she found it, a shirt, white, crisp, and foreign in its aura. As she folded laundry in the dim light of the back room, her hands moving by instinct and not thought, her fingers brushed over a collar too stiff, too recently cleaned. She paused, looked closer, and there it was, a smudge of red lipstick, but not the kind of red worn in Eden. More. This wasn't the soft berry tones the women wore on Christmas, or the fading pinks of morning seasons. This was fire truck, city-born, mirror-kissing red, the kind of red that came with long nails and sharp heels. Eliza's thumb lingered near the stain, but she didn't rub it. She just stared, and everything inside her went quiet. Not the peace of surrender, but the silence of reckoning. She folded the shirt as she always did, laying it neatly on top of the stack, not because it was clean, but because it was done. Her heart didn't race. Her knees didn't shake. She looked out the window into the darkening yard, where the roses stood still, their petals closed. Even they knew something had shifted. "The heart is deceitful above all things," she whispered, not in anger, but in understanding. She left the pile, walked to the kitchen, lit a candle, and said no more. For in that moment, she understood something that would change everything. The truth doesn't always scream. Sometimes it arrives wearing perfume, tucked into fabric, waiting for hands like hers to find it. She arrived in Eden more the way a storm creeps up on a still afternoon, unannounced, unwelcome, but impossible to ignore. The car she drove was too loud for the road, too new for a village that still believed in oil lanterns and Sunday shoes. The engine growled as it climbed the dusty path toward the center of town, spitting the scent of fuel and foreignness into the air. The villagers noticed instantly. Eyes peeked from lace curtains, fingers paused mid-sweep on verandas. Nobody needed to be told she wasn't from around here. It showed in her walk, in the shine of her sunglasses, in the tilt of her chin. She was dressed in a red blouse that hugged her like a whisper with bad intentions, and heels that tapped against the cobblestones like warning shots. Children stopped mid-play. Vendors forgot their change. She walked through the market like a woman who had nothing to fear and everything to prove. The bread-seller's daughter muttered beneath her breath, "City woman," and her mother elbowed her quickly, whispering, "Be careful." That kind carries fire behind her smile. When Sienna Hale, for that was the name she gave, reached the stall where plantain and pepper were sold, she asked for directions. Not to the town square, not to the church, but to the Marin house. That was the moment Edenmore gasped, not with sound, but with silence. She wasn't looking for a hotel or a cousin. She was looking for Eliza's home. The way she said it, as if the house already belonged to her, made the hair on several necks stand. The butcher dropped his knife. The baker forgot her dough in the oven. No one spoke, but everyone understood. A stranger had come not to pass through, but to plant herself where she did not belong. Eliza had just taken the stew off the fire when the doorbell rang, a sound that rarely came during the week, especially not in the late afternoon, when the sun casts long shadows and the birds begin their return home. She wiped her hands calmly on a clean cloth and walked to the door with the same grace she used for everything else. She didn't hurry. She didn't hesitate. Her slippers barely made a sound across the floor, as if the house itself was listening with bated breath. When she opened the door, she was met by the face of a woman she had never seen before, young, painted, confident in a way that felt performative. The woman stood with her suitcase beside her, the kind with wheels and pride, and a half-smile that carried insult and challenge in equal measure. Eliza took in the sight, the red lips, the styled curls, the body language of someone who believed they'd won before the game even started. "I'm here for him," Sienna said, voice too steady for someone who should have felt shame. "He told me everything. Said this house was ours now." She didn't blink. She didn't ask to come in. She simply waited, like a queen expecting her throne to be rolled out. Eliza said nothing for a moment. Her silence stretched, not from shock, but precision. She examined the woman from crown to toe, then turned slightly to the side and opened the door wider, not in invitation, but in command. The same way a lion steps aside not because it fears a fox, but because it knows its place isn't threatened. As Sienna stepped in, heels clicking arrogantly on the tile, Eliza turned her head slowly and said only one thing, "Then you've been told lies." It wasn't said with bitterness. It was said like a prophecy, sealed and certain. The house inhaled. The spirit in the walls stirred. Something had entered that didn't belong, and everything knew it except the intruder herself. The days that followed unfolded not with war, but with watchfulness. Sienna moved into the home as if claiming a prize, dragging her suitcase over Eliza's clean floors, touching surfaces she didn't understand, rearranging things that had been in place since Eliza's grandmother sang psalms in that very kitchen. The air began to feel thick, like a room where too many unspoken words were packed between the walls. Sienna paraded herself through the halls in short robes, answered the door in Eliza's slippers, and poured wine into glasses that once held anointing oil. She didn't ask permission. She assumed possession. Yet Eliza said nothing. Not because she was weak, but because she understood the power of letting a snake believe the path ahead is clear. She continued her routines with quiet elegance, watered her garden, washed her floors, laid the table with 3 sets of cutlery instead of 2. She watched Thomas return home and find both women in his line of vision. Watched his face tighten with a guilt so obvious it turned the air sour. He tried to speak, but the words collapsed at his lips. He offered silence in place of explanation, and Eliza accepted it, not as surrender, but as confirmation. At night, she lay beside herself in a bed she once shared, staring at the ceiling like it held her future. Sienna slept across the hall, in a room she chose without asking, unaware that the bed frame was blessed with prayer and memory. There were no fights, no screams, just a thickening tension that coated every surface like dusk. Sienna smiled too much. Thomas drank too much. Eliza prayed too much, but only those who knew her would recognize the increase. She wasn't afraid. She was preparing. The village spoke in whispers, the way it always did when something sacred was being threatened, but no one dared confront Eliza. They respected her too much to speak foolishly, and feared her too much to meddle. Some pitied her, others admired her, but none of them truly understood her silence. They didn't see how she watched Sienna try to decorate the house in colors that didn't belong, trying to change the scent of the rooms, trying to insert herself in places that rejected her spirit. The house resisted, light bulbs flickered, chairs creaked with protest, and the front gate refused to close properly, as though even the hinges were offended. One afternoon, Sienna tried to cut roses from Eliza's garden, hoping to place them in a vase for the sitting room, but the thorns bit her hand, drawing blood. She screamed, dropping the shears. Eliza walked out onto the porch, saw the scene, and said only, "They don't bloom for strangers." It wasn't cruelty, it was truth, and the roses knew it. Even Thomas began to unravel. He avoided being home. Work, once a responsibility, became an escape. When he was home, he hovered, lost, ashamed, afraid of both women, yet more afraid of what he had broken. But Eliza remained centered. She did not shrink. She began rising earlier, sleeping deeper, walking slower. Every move she made became a declaration. Her silence became architecture. Her poise became prophecy. Even the birds on the windowsill began to return. Nature, it seemed, remembered who belonged. And while Sienna played queen in a house that did not bow, Eliza waited not for a moment to react, but for the right moment to rise. It began like this. Each morning, the house woke before its inhabitants, as though the walls themselves were preparing for battle. The mirrors fogged without heat, the floorboards creaked not with age, but with agitation, and the kitchen door swung open of its own accord, even when locked. Something unseen had shifted. The energy in the Marin household now wore two faces. One, a mask of civility, and the other, a ghost of discomfort that wandered freely from room to room. Sienna rose early, but not to pray, not to sweep, not to give thanks. She rose to conquer. Her stilettos clacked over sacred tiles. She wore silk in a house that had only known cotton and linen. She left perfume in the air like graffiti. Even her laughter didn't echo properly. It hung too long in the corners, sounding like arrogance with nowhere to go. She made phone calls loudly, crossing her legs on Eliza's settee, flipping her hair as she spoke to her friends in far cities who envied her new life with a man whose soul was still elsewhere. Eliza, on the other hand, said little. She kept her routines, down to the exact second the kettle whistled and the moment her garden received its morning watering. She didn't look at Sienna unless required. She didn't argue. She didn't roll her eyes, but every movement she made was a reminder. She didn't raise her voice because truth doesn't shout when it knows the soil beneath its feet. Even the maids knew where loyalty lay. They continued to address Eliza as Madam, and when Sienna tried to correct them, their mouths smiled, but their eyes remained loyal. Sienna could change the curtains, but she could not change the air. She could sit on the couch, but she could not rest, for the house had already chosen. The house remembered hands that built it with humility. It rejected the spirit of entitlement like the body rejects poison, and though Thomas refused to notice, everyone else did. The spiritual climate of the home had become a battlefield, and though the swords were invisible, the wounds were very real. Thomas drifted through this new reality like a man who'd built his own prison and thrown away the keys. At first, he thought having both women in the house would solve his indecision. A foolish man's dream, to have the calm and the chaos under one roof, one for memory, the other for fantasy. But what he hadn't calculated was the weight of presence. Sienna, for all her flair, could not command a room the way Eliza could. Eliza didn't speak much, but when she entered a space, the silence shifted to accommodate her. When she passed by, people adjusted their posture, lowered their tones, or became suddenly aware of what they were saying. Thomas noticed it too. He noticed how the villagers still greeted Eliza first. He noticed how she had not once wept in front of him, nor raised her voice, nor even asked a single question. It disturbed him more than shouting would have. Her quiet endurance was a mirror to his cowardice. Sienna, on the other hand, began to feel the heat of her own victory. She had fought to be seen, yet found herself invisible in the very place she thought she'd conquered. She tried too hard. Too many outfits, too much perfume, too many selfies with furniture that didn't welcome her touch. She bought new dishes, which no one used. She placed scented candles around the house, but the flames didn't dance the way they did when Eliza lit them. Even Thomas began to withdraw from her, offering only tired nods and long hours spent locked in his study. He no longer touched her with the same eager hands. Her jokes fell flat. Her meals, when she attempted to cook, tasted of unfamiliar spice and unspoken regret. Thomas had sown confusion and was now reaping fatigue. The thrill was gone. What remained was tension thick enough to choke on, and Sienna began to realize that even if you win a house, you cannot inherit its soul. No matter how many times she crossed the threshold, the home folded itself around Eliza, not her. The villagers of Eden Moor continued their quiet observation, as only villagers can. Their eyes noticed things the tongue did not dare to mention, like how Eliza's garden bloomed despite Sienna's interference, or how the cat that roamed the compound only sat near Eliza's feet. They observed that children passing the house still waved at Eliza but frowned at Sienna, their instincts sharper than adult politeness. And when church bells rang on Sundays, Eliza still wore her simple white headscarf and walked gracefully to her pew, while Sienna stayed behind, claiming headaches or errands. The women at the well spoke in code. "Some visitors come like rain," one said, rinsing cassava. "And others like termites," another replied, wringing her wrapper. No names needed to be said. The whole village was the jury, and the verdict was forming. But through all this, Eliza never asked for sympathy. She never solicited allies. Her strength was not broadcasted, it was embodied. It lived in her tone when she greeted the elders. It rested in the way she served tea with both hands, even when Sienna drank it without thanks. Eliza carried herself like one who had endured fire and come out scented with frankincense. Meanwhile, Sienna became increasingly frustrated. She tried to throw small jabs, suggesting the old sofa needed changing, calling Eliza auntie with fake sweetness, even once mocking her cooking as too plain. But Eliza never flinched. She responded with dignity. When Sienna mocked the stew, Eliza simply said, "Salt cannot teach pepper how to sting." The room fell into silence, and Sienna did not speak again. Thomas looked up from his plate that night, but Eliza had already moved on, ladling soup with the same calm that unnerved him. She didn't want pity. She didn't want revenge. She wanted restoration, and she knew it would not come through argument, but through divine timing. The confrontation never arrived with fists or shouts. It came in layers, through dreams that refused to let Sienna rest, through whispers in the corridors that weren't spoken by human mouths, through the weight of being an intruder in a home whose spirit rejected her. One night, Sienna had a dream. In it, the house crumbled and rebuilt itself without her. She stood outside in the cold, knocking, weeping, begging to be let in, but the door refused. She woke up in a sweat, only to find the power had gone out, and her room was colder than the rest of the house. She rushed to Thomas's side, whispering about demons, about bad spirits, but he only rubbed his eyes and turned away. Eliza, that morning, hummed a hymn as she swept the front steps, as if she already knew. Something had shifted again. The atmosphere had moved. Even the sunlight came in differently, as though the heavens themselves had tilted in Eliza's favor. The final straw came when Sienna tried to remove the wooden cross above the door, claiming it made the space look old-fashioned. The nails would not budge. The more she pulled, the more the hammer slipped. Her hands blistered. She screamed in frustration. Eliza watched her from the hallway, eyes calm. "That cross was placed with prayer," she said. "It won't move for flesh." After that, Sienna began staying in her room longer. Her clothes stayed in the wardrobe but no longer felt like they belonged. Her voice became quieter, her movements less confident. Eliza's authority was not asserted, it was revealed. And as the days crawled forward, it became clear the house had made its choice. So had the spirit that governed it. And no matter how long Sienna stayed, she would never dwell. She was a visitor in a story too sacred for her hands. Sienna began to feel the weight of her own arrival. The sharp edge of her triumph dulled into discomfort. The thrill of intrusion turned sour like milk left too long under the sun. She had entered the house with the boldness of one promised a throne, but it did not take long for the crown to feel counterfeit on her head. She could no longer ignore the unease that crept into her chest each time Eliza passed by in silence, dressed in white linen and the kind of grace that cannot be mimicked. Eliza's silence was no longer just unsettling, it had become unbearable. It was as if the walls whispered her authority and the floor beneath Sienna's feet refused to hold her with trust. She noticed how her music didn't sound right in the house. Even her laughter, once carefree and triumphant, began to sound forced, like a joke that had overstayed its welcome. And though she still tried, wearing finer dresses, cooking strange meals, leaving lipstick-stained notes for Thomas, the house remained unwelcoming. She began to hear small noises in the hallway at night, sounds that made her grip the sheets and stare at the shadows, too proud to admit fear. But the fear grew. In the morning she would wear bold lipstick, louder jewelry, walk harder, but it didn't fix the quiet rejection around her. Even Thomas, the man she once called her escape, began to withdraw like a wave that had gone too far in and was too tired to return. His affection became stiff, his eyes always somewhere behind her, as though she reminded him of a decision he could not defend. Her dreams became troubled. One night she dreamed she stood at the altar in Eliza's gown, but when she turned to look at the groom, there was no one there. She awoke gasping, and when she told Thomas, he only muttered something about too much pepper in her stew. But Sienna knew. The house had rejected her. The village had rejected her. And worst of all, the man she sacrificed her pride for was now treating her like an afterthought in a chapter she was never meant to be part of. Eliza, meanwhile, had begun to change in ways that no one expected, especially not Sienna. She did not rise with vengeance in her eyes, nor did she fall to pieces in the shadows. She bloomed quietly. She began to reappear in public spaces she once avoided, returning to the town square, accepting invitations for evening teas, offering calm counsel at women's gatherings. And wherever she walked, people adjusted themselves. There was something renewed about her, a strength that now shimmered visibly, like gold that had been tested by fire. Her eyes, once clouded with exhaustion, had cleared. Her laugh returned, not loud or dramatic, but full, honest. Even the way she carried her basket at the market spoke volumes. The vendors who once felt pity now smiled with reverence. Eliza had become more than a wife. She had become a figure of resilience, and as her presence grew in strength, Sienna seemed to dim by comparison. Eliza did not mock, nor did she gloat. She extended the same civility she always had, but her grace now cut deeper than any insult. Thomas began to see it too, though he did not admit it out loud. He started lingering in the places Eliza walked through. He sat longer at the dinner table when she was there. He listened when she spoke, and when she was quiet, he noticed. For the first time in years, he was beginning to remember why he had once knelt before her with a ring in his hand and trembling in his voice. And yet he could not undo what had been done. Eliza knew this, but she also knew that forgiveness was not about forgetting. It was about releasing the burden into the hands of God. So she gave it over, not in a grand gesture, not in words, but in her every action. She showed that she had chosen peace over pride, dignity over drama. She had learned, through pain and endurance, that sometimes God doesn't remove the enemy. He prepares a table in front of them. Sienna's discomfort slowly turned to paranoia. She started to believe the house was working against her. She thought the mirrors distorted her reflection. She believed the chairs creaked louder when she sat, and the paintings on the wall seemed to frown when she entered the room. Once she swore she heard Eliza humming scripture in the middle of the night, even though Eliza's room was closed and her door untouched. Another time, the rose bushes in the garden, long a source of Eliza's pride, scratched her wrist when she tried to pluck one. The blood lingered longer than the wound, a faint mark that made her hide her arm with silk sleeves. She became restless, pacing the halls with footsteps that had lost their rhythm. When the church bell rang on Sunday morning, Eliza would leave in a white dress with her Bible pressed to her chest, while Sienna stayed behind, sitting by the window pretending to read a magazine she could not focus on. Even the dog, old and lazy as it was, now followed Eliza around the compound and ignored Sienna completely. She began to cry alone in the room she once claimed as her own. She was losing the battle she didn't even realize had started the day she stepped through the front door. Her beauty could no longer shield her. Her confidence now cracked in the smallest conversations. Even her voice faltered when she tried to speak up at dinner. The house was pushing her out without lifting a single finger. And all the while, Eliza remained silent, not with indifference, but with purpose. Her silence was not absence, it was strategy. Because the strongest warriors do not flinch when the enemy flails. They wait. They observe. And when the time is right, they rise not with swords, but with presence so powerful that everything false must bow before it. Then came the storm. Not the kind that rumbled in the sky, but one that broke branches and whispered warnings through its wind. It came in the late hours, sudden and angry. Thunder slapped the heavens, and rain pounded the rooftop like feet running from something unseen. Trees bent in surrender. Leaves flew like torn letters. The village hushed. The air turned thick, and lightning split the sky in jagged lines of fury. In the middle of it all, the old oak tree in Eliza's garden, the one her grandmother had once planted with a prayer and a psalm, was struck by lightning. The crack was so loud, it echoed across Eden. More. The next morning, it stood split but still upright, charred at the center yet holding its form. Sienna stood at the window, pale and shaking. Eliza walked outside in the rain with her shawl draped over one shoulder and placed her hand on the tree's bark, whispering a verse only heaven could hear. When she came back in, she dried her feet, looked at the floor, then at Thomas, and finally at Sienna, who could no longer meet her eyes. No words were exchanged, but everything had shifted. It was clear, now more than ever, nature itself had spoken. The house, the land, even the tree, all were declaring the truth that had been buried beneath makeup and manipulation. And Eliza, who had said little and done nothing by force, had stood so still, so steady, that the storm bowed to her instead of breaking her. She had not reacted in anger, but in alignment. She had not fought back, but everything had fought for her. From that day forward, Sienna moved slower. Thomas sat longer in silence. And Eliza began to shine like the sun after rain, golden, unapologetic, and utterly unshakable. Thomas Marin came home the evening after the storm with a tiredness he could no longer disguise. His steps, once confident even in guilt, had softened into something closer to shame. He paused at the gate longer than usual, hand resting on the iron latch, not from indecision but dread. He had become a stranger in his own house, no longer in control of the atmosphere or the attention. There was a time when he believed that his charm, his money, and his name were enough to hold any space together, but standing under the bruised sky with rainwater still trickling down the gutters, he realized too late that names alone don't build homes. Integrity does. And he had left his behind in hotel rooms and whispered promises. He walked into the house with slow feet, listening to the silence as though it might accuse him. It didn't. It just watched him. The hallway lights flickered briefly, once, then steadied. The smell of warm soup drifted from the kitchen, familiar but distant, like a memory of something lost. He saw Eliza seated in the parlor, a shawl across her lap, her fingers moving rhythmically across the pages of a well-worn Bible. She didn't look up. Her presence no longer reached out to greet him. It stood still, sovereign, requiring nothing. Sienna was nowhere to be seen. That in itself was a message. He removed his shoes quietly, like a man entering a sanctuary he had defiled. Eliza eventually looked at him, not with hatred or bitterness, but with a stillness that struck deeper than any raised voice could. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. It was then he knew. He was not facing the same woman he had left behind. This Eliza was no longer waiting to be chosen. She was standing fully in herself, and if he was to be a part of her world again, it would not be as the man he had been. Later that evening, they sat across from each other in the dining room for the first time in weeks without Sienna's perfume lingering in the air or her laughter bouncing off walls that no longer tolerated it. There was only the clinking of cutlery and the quiet hum of the lantern as it flickered above them. Thomas tried again to speak, forcing his throat to produce the apology he had crafted in his mind on the long drive home. Eliza, She raised her hand slowly, palm facing him, fingers steady. Not in a gesture of dismissal, but control. Don't start with what you think I want to hear, she said, voice calm as standing water before a stone is thrown. Speak what you've been afraid to say. Her words sat heavy between them, and for once Thomas did not reach for excuses. He spoke of weakness, of how he had allowed admiration from outsiders to poison his sight, how he had chased excitement and found emptiness, how every room without her had felt hollow, no matter how brightly it sparkled. He did not cry, but his voice broke in places, like a man confessing to himself more than to her. Eliza listened with eyes that did not blink too much, lips that did not tighten in judgment. She had already heard this apology in prayer before he ever brought it home. When he finished, she stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the rain-kissed garden, where the oak tree still stood, split but undefeated. This house, she said, was never held together by your hands. It was held by covenant. Her voice didn't shake. You broke the promise. And promises are not like windows that can be mended with glue. They are living things. When they die, something inside dies with them. He swallowed hard, expecting her to say more, but she turned away and walked into the kitchen without slamming a single door. She hadn't told him to leave, but she hadn't welcomed him back either. The limbo was punishment enough. Sienna's presence in the house had dwindled into something ghost-like. She moved less, spoke only when necessary, and had stopped wearing the bright red lipstick that once made her feel invincible. Her once bold perfume was replaced by the scent of lavender soap, as though trying to mimic the peace that refused to rest upon her. She had packed and unpacked her suitcase 3 times in 1 week, each time folding her clothes with robotic slowness, waiting for some sign from Thomas, or from heaven, or perhaps from her own mirror that would tell her whether to stay or go. But the mirrors only showed a face she no longer recognized, a woman tired of fighting a war she had no skill to win. She avoided Eliza now, even in shared spaces. Once she stood at the bottom of the stairs as Eliza passed with folded linens in her hand. Their eyes met. Eliza didn't flinch. Sienna looked down first. That was when she knew her time was ending. You can sleep in a house, but if the spirit of the place does not accept you, it begins to push you out in invisible ways. The teacups clink louder, the floor gets colder, even the lights feel heavier when turned on. She sat in her room that night, hugging a pillow, thinking of all the moments she had believed Thomas's promises, that he would start a new life with her, that they would erase the past. But you cannot build joy on someone else's ashes. And Eliza, who had watched her do all the things a desperate woman does to be seen, provoking, seducing, controlling, never once returned the energy. She had walked through that valley holding only one thing, the knowledge of who she was. It became a mirror Sienna couldn't look into. And in that mirror, All she saw was a shadow pretending to be a queen in a palace that still whispered Eliza's name in the wind. The next morning was unusually still. The sky was pale, the wind soft as though nature itself was watching. Sienna came down the stairs dressed in beige. No jewelry, no makeup, no scent. She sat at the breakfast table across from Thomas, who was reading a newspaper he hadn't flipped past the first page. "I'm leaving," she said, voice flat, without sorrow or rage. "You don't have to say anything." "I already know." He looked at her, and for a moment he saw not the woman who had turned his head in the city, but a girl who had mistaken attention for affection. He didn't beg. He didn't ask her to stay. The silence between them agreed it was time. She stood, walked up the stairs, and began to pack for the final time. Downstairs, Eliza was tending to the plants by the window, humming quietly. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The house felt it. Peace was returning. The spirit of the place exhaled. An hour later, Sienna walked through the front door with her luggage. She paused at the threshold, turned once, as if hoping someone would call her back, but the only sound was the breeze rustling the leaves. She stepped into the car and drove off, disappearing around the bend, and with her went every trace of disquiet. Thomas remained seated on the edge of his own decisions, staring into his hands. Eliza stepped outside into the garden, the morning sun touching her skin, and she whispered not a song of victory, but a prayer of thanks. She had lost nothing. Everything meant for her remained. What was not hers had removed itself, and that is the kind of peace no storm can undo. The morning after Sienna left, the house woke with a gentleness that had not been felt in months. Even the light seemed different, no longer struggling to find its place between walls heavy with tension. The curtains swayed as if sighing, grateful to breathe again. The kitchen, once filled with divided glances and silent meals, welcomed the scent of ripe pawpaw and cinnamon. Eliza rose early, not out of habit but purpose. There was no longer a shadow in her home pretending to fit, no eyes watching her with contempt, no heels clicking through hallways like foreign invaders on sacred ground. The peace was so thick she could feel it under her soles, like the earth had remembered who tended it. She stood by the kitchen window, looking out into the garden. The roses were blooming again, wild, radiant, unafraid. Even the split oak tree, burned down the middle by lightning, had begun sprouting tiny green buds along its darker bark. It stood not as a reminder of destruction, but of survival. She stepped outside barefoot and placed her hand on its trunk. "Thank you," she whispered, not to the tree, not to the morning, but to the one who had seen it all. The nights of questioning, the days of restraint, the betrayal that dared sit in her living room. He had seen it all, and now she stood in a house no longer broken, but blessed. Thomas had not left, but he had changed. He moved quieter now, aware of the space he once filled carelessly. He asked permission before joining her in the kitchen. He prayed before eating. He no longer assumed anything. Eliza noticed, but she said nothing. Some wounds need silence to close. Some reconciliation comes not through words, but through the rhythm of changed behavior over time. She didn't rush forgiveness, nor did she rehearse bitterness. She simply continued, and the house, at last, followed her lead. It was a week later when the village truly understood what had taken place. Eliza walked into the market with her basket lined with fresh cloth, her step slow and steady. She wore a sky-blue headscarf tied tightly and a plain white blouse tucked into a wrapper with the patterns of her late grandmother's tribe. The market quieted when she arrived, not from fear, but respect. Women nudged their daughters. Men stepped aside. She greeted everyone with a nod and a quiet, "Good morning," not one word more than needed, yet each word felt like an embrace. They had watched her walk through the valley and never once begged for sympathy. They had seen her silence stand stronger than most women's screams. Eliza didn't have to explain herself. The village already knew. They had seen the other woman, bold and loud, arrive in a car that stirred dust, thinking the noise of her heels could command roots that took decades to grow. And they had seen Eliza endure it all with grace that did not bend. Some of the older women approached her with offerings, small bags of kola nut, pepper, dried fish, not in pity, but as tribute. Eliza smiled and accepted them. She went from stall to stall, pricing slowly, greeting intentionally. She even paused to speak to a teenage girl who had recently lost her mother. "You're not alone," she told her. "It won't feel like it forever." She had become more than just a quiet woman who lived on Marigold Road. She had become a symbol of strength, of womanhood, of how to wait without withering. And as she left the market with her basket full and her dignity intact, the sun broke fully through the clouds. The people of Eden, more, even those who once misunderstood her, could not deny it anymore. Eliza had not only kept her house, she had reclaimed her name, her silence, and her strength, without ever needing to become someone else. Thomas, for his part, did not ask for things to return to how they once were. Deep down, he knew he had forfeited that version of life when he opened the door to another woman and allowed her to sit at the table built by loyalty. He now moved like a man who had been given mercy, but not immunity. He watched Eliza from afar, often catching glimpses of her reading under the mango tree or washing cassava by the basin. He wanted to approach her, to say thank you or I'm sorry in new ways, but he didn't know how to speak to a woman who had grown beyond him. He now understood that the woman he married was no longer the same. She had transformed, not into someone bitter or hard, but into someone so grounded in her identity that no wind could shake her again. He began helping in small ways, fixing the roof tiles, feeding the chickens, showing up at church early to wipe the pews. Not because she asked him to, but because he needed to offer something to the place he had wounded. Slowly, she allowed his presence. Not in her heart just yet, but in her space. She no longer tensed when he entered a room. She no longer avoided his touch, though she didn't invite it either. They shared meals now, but each meal was its own chapter, sometimes filled with silence, other times with soft conversation. One evening, he found her singing as she swept the corridor. A simple hymn, the kind his mother used to sing. He stood at the end of the hallway, watching her back, wondering how she still had music in her spirit after all he had done. But that was Eliza. Her joy was not circumstantial. It was anchored in something deeper, something eternal. He understood now that he would spend the rest of his life not asking to be loved again, but proving he was worth being kept nearby. And that alone was a kind of healing. On the first Sunday after everything had settled, Eliza stood in front of the mirror in her room for a long while, not adjusting her scarf or makeup, but simply looking at herself. The woman staring back wasn't a victim. She wasn't even just a survivor. She was whole. She picked up her Bible, the same one passed down from her grandmother, its corners soft with use and its margins marked with prayers too personal to read aloud. As she stepped outside, Thomas waited by the gate. He didn't offer to walk with her. He simply opened the gate, bowed his head slightly, and let her pass through. It was enough. At church, she took her usual seat, not at the front where the showy women like to be seen, but near the middle, where real worship lives. The choir sang a song about restoration, and her eyes closed naturally. Tears came, but they were not bitter. They were the kind that wash away years of strain, the kind that say, I'm still here. After service, people greeted her like always, but this time there was an awe in their tone. They weren't just greeting Eliza Marin. They were greeting a woman who had walked through betrayal, humiliation, and spiritual fire and come out smelling like redemption. As she walked home beneath the heat of the noon sun, she stopped by the oak tree once more, her fingers brushing its rough bark. She whispered one final prayer, too low for anyone else to hear, then turned and walked inside. The door closed behind her, not with finality, but with peace. The kind of peace that says, this story ends with dignity, not drama. Beloved listener, and that's they feel, unbeloved listener, unbeloved listener, and the fightings of Allah, and bond the wrinkled souls, and the tender, refrigerator, and balsam about the life symphony, in worthless berries at the diva, and bowls of everlasting, and bowl of a dismal. This story wasn't just about Eliza. It was about you, about anyone who's ever had to smile with a bleeding heart, about those who've stayed quiet when the world said fight and held their ground when it would have been easier to walk away. It's for the people who've been pushed aside in their own home, betrayed where they should have been protected, and tested where they should have been trusted. You see, not every battle needs a sword. Some victories come through stillness, through dignity, through the wisdom of letting God fight for you. Eliza didn't scream to be heard. She didn't beg to be loved. She didn't trade her identity to prove a point. She remembered who she was, even when someone tried to walk in her place. If you're listening and you've been overlooked, disrespected, or replaced, don't lose yourself trying to prove your worth. What is meant for you cannot be stolen. The crown God placed on your head does not shrink to fit another. Your silence is not weakness. It is a statement that you trust God more than you trust your emotions. And if someone has entered your life claiming space they didn't build, making noise where they haven't earned reverence, breathe. Watch. Wait. The same God who stood with Eliza will stand with you too. And when the time is right, he will show the world whose hands truly carried the grace, the oil, the authority. So don't curse the process. Let the betrayal refine you. Let the silence grow you. Let the storm pass, and when it does, you'll rise, stronger, wiser, and with peace that cannot be faked. Now, take a moment to close your eyes, soften your spirit, and come with me into a place of prayer. The one who sees the quiet tears and hears the prayers that are too deep for words, we come before you with humble hearts, bringing every listener who has walked through pain they never spoke out loud. For the one who stayed silent when their heart was breaking, for the one who chose dignity over destruction, for the one who endured what others couldn't have survived, this prayer is for them. Lord, cover them with a new strength, the kind that doesn't just keep them standing, but makes them rise like royalty. Wrap them in peace that confuses their enemies. Let your presence fill every place that once held betrayal. We speak over their lives, no more striving to prove worth, no more begging to be seen, no more shrinking to make others comfortable. They are chosen. They are called. And what you have ordained for them, no mistress, no liar, no betrayal can take away. We declare healing over broken trust, restoration over wounded homes, boldness where fear once lived, and laughter where sorrow tried to linger. Just like Eliza, may they walk with quiet power, with grace that cannot be shaken, and with the assurance that God defends those who wait on him. Bless their hands, Lord. May whatever they touch bloom again. Bless their voice. May it carry wisdom when they speak. And bless their name. Let it be associated with strength, not scandal, honor, not humiliation. May their enemies watch them thrive. May those who wrote them off have to watch you write them back into victory. May their story be the proof that you are still the God who lifts up the broken and silences the proud. And when it's all said and done, may they say it was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. In the mighty name of Jesus, the Restorer, the Defender, the one who never loses a case, we pray. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.